Hello. I have a good news and a bad news. The bad news is that Mr. Obrist will not come because he's organizing his spectacle, Il Tempo del Postino, that opens tonight, that premieres tonight, and he's very much taken by these last-minute details. But he will launch this book that we intended to present you Friday after the discussion he has with Philippe Tinari from 5 to 5:30 at the same place here. So if one of you wanted to get a copy of the book signed by Mr. Obrist or talk with Mr. Obrist, I'm afraid you have to come back another time. The good news is that we have Christophe Cherix with us and Karen Martin, and that we will still be able to introduce you to this book and to a couple of stories that revolve around this project. Very briefly, you probably all know that Ulrich Obrist is I could write an interview machine or something like this. Every day, every morning, he's ready to do an interview with one artist or one cultural thinker. And I witnessed that many times, that he actually gets up at 5:30 and makes this interview. So the book of Brief History of Curating came out of numerous interviews he did with curators, let's say around the last 15 years. We suddenly realized that he had recorded some of these figures that made the history of curating, but were not necessarily registered by art history or not necessarily so well known to the public. So it sounded to us like a mine of information and a very interesting editorial project to gather some of them, edit them, fact-checking, complement some issues that were discussed in live conversation and that needed some precisions, and articulate them together, commission one or two new ones, and make this book. In the process of doing this, we had several ideas of who could make an introduction, who could explain to the general audience what this book means, and we came upon Christophe Cherix, who is the distinguished art historian who now works at the MoMA as a curator for prints and books. Am I right?
Exactly.
Thank you. And has developed a certain knowledge territory around, let's say, some experiments with curating and with printed matters from the 60s and 70s in particular. But of course, this knowledge extends far beyond. And we thought it would be interesting because we had long discussions with Christophe and Hans about how this figure of the curator is registered. How can you define the work of a curator? What is exactly an exhibition? I mean, in one way you could say, if you look at art history of the last 50 years, that a lot of the art was produced as an exhibition rather as a painting or sculpture in a studio. At the same time, the recording of these things is very complicated to do. And there's a lack of documentation, there's a lack of methodology to register this history and to write it and to provide curators or students or artists a good account, a precise account of what really happened, of what a show was precisely articulated upon, from historical exhibition to more experimental projects. And I don't know if you want to comment on this, but I think that was really one of the impulse for Hans to collect these interviews, and that was also probably an impulse for for a lot of literature who came out recently. I mean, I'm thinking of the Faden book or a couple of books of this time.
No, I think this book provides really a small archive. I don't know if you can, is it okay? Do you hear me? Basically, the book gives something which is very precious to the history of the 20th century, mostly of the second part of the 20th century, because most of the art, or the most radical art produced, let's say in the 60s and 70s, was done through the medium of exhibitions. And we were lacking basically a recording of those early curatorial processes at that time, when we are basically trying to redefine the history of those years. And what Hans Ulrich did was to basically go door to door almost, and to meet a number of the essential curators of those years. And since the book is published, I mean, a number of them have died. I mean, it's very urgent for us to understand better what the role of the curator was in those early essential years for the understanding of the art of today. And what is very contradictory for me is that most of those curators try to be invisible. I mean, that the idea is to be a guide to the viewer, to bring the art of those emerging artists to the public without interfering too much between the public and the artist. But at the same time, we understand today that their own invisibility is one of the problems, because they gave often few interviews, and you had few recordings or even photo documentation of those important exhibitions. And today we are trying, and sometimes almost desperately, to reconstitute some of those early shows of the late 60s and 70s, when location was absolutely essential in order to still be able to present those works and to have an idea not only how to show them today, but how to show them in 50 years. And that's why I think this book was an important step in that process.
It's quite funny when you think that when Harald Zeeman was doing Documenta 5, how criticized he was by some artists to maybe not be that invisible, or to maybe challenge the perception of what a curator is doing, and compare it to what today is the situation of a curator. I mean, when you have 500 curatorial programs in the world, by definition you're supposed to teach something to these students. They're supposed to teach them what curating is and how to curate and how to become a good or important curator, or I don't know, relevant curator, whatever is the term. And one thing that struck me when I was reading the first interviews that Hans Ulrich was sending was that, in fact, there's a lack of methodology, of even what you do as a curator. What is exactly allowed? When do you go too far? What is your mediation role supposed to be, etc. And an interesting moment was from in the 60s, in the early 60s, in the end of the 50s and the early 60s, when these people had quite a large freedom in museum and in a lot of artistic context to try to define this role and to try to see if they could become maybe a bit more than a mediator for the art, but someone who collaborates with the artist, for instance, or someone who proposes some artistic rules to artists. And I think that's, in that sense, an archive of these figures and these moments of self-definition of a practice that just came out of, as you said, like as a door-to-door practice. Hans Ulrich was basically making oral history. He was going to interview one after the other, and there's also this chain reaction that in general Hans is very much into, which is you meet someone that explains you that this person is very important for your development, and then you decide to meet this person as well and to use what you have learned in the first interview in the second and the third, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing is trying to reconstitute some kind of network active at the time, and that was not only involving curators but institutions, artists, and I mean a quite large number of people. And today, I mean, one of the, and that's why I like that the book is essentially collective, is that it tries to bring to mind that what really created the art of that time is a number of relationships between Europe and the United States, between Japan and the United States, and so on. And that's, I think, very hard for us today to imagine that how museums were able to work together, how galleries were basically working, you know, one after the other with the same artists, creating like strings of shows both in Europe and the United States. So time has changed a lot in the last 40 years. And we could even argue that the changes between the 60s and today are almost as radical as the changes from the 20s and the 60s. And if we go back in the 20th centuries, we realize that most of the curators were artists. And that's again something else. I mean, when Ulrich decided to start his interviews, of course, with living persons, it's people who started working in the 60s, so he couldn't go further in the century. But what we witnessed in the 60s is really a professionalization of the function of the curator, and that's something which became a fact only today. I mean, the boundaries in the 60s are not as strict as we imagine them in our society.
Walter Hobbs is a perfect example.
To be exactly in the middle.
Because he began as a gallery. He began a gallery, the Ferris Gallery.
With Kienholz.
With Kienholz, which was not economically successful until later. But that it wasn't until he went to an institution that his methodology became clearly at odds with the institution. When he went to work in Washington, and he was unable to ever get anywhere on time. Yeah. And Hans Zurich didn't know until he visited him. He didn't really understand. He didn't even really understand that he was the first. He knew that he was the first person to have done a Duchamp show, but he didn't realize he was the first one to have done a pop show. Although he felt that pop was an overused word, so he didn't put it into the title, which means without the sort of documentation, then information isn't known, which is why these interviews are interesting. Yeah.
I mean, Hobbs was really one of those key figures able to collaborate with artists really from the beginning. I mean, you mentioned like new paintings of the common object, which is kind of defining show for pop art in the early 60s. And one anecdote that I always liked is related to the poster of the show.
Yeah.
And of course you need a poster, and Walter Hobbs wasn't a graphic designer, and you know exactly what he needed, something new, something which was able to embody this new generation of artists. And so he asked Ed Ruscha to take care of the poster. And Ed Ruscha didn't know exactly what to do himself. So, and he didn't want to do something too graphic-y or something too arty. So what he did, and I think it's just a wonderful example, he just called a screen print commercial workshop.
Wrestling.
Basically people who would just produce advertisement for cars, for shows, for the industry, but not for art. And he did that over the phone. So he just gave the guy like the title of the show, the artist in the show, the dates, the name of the museum, with only one instruction: make it loud. And the poster was extremely successful because it really completely, I think, captured this idea of this art, which was basically merging with popular culture, trying to grab that efficiency and to bring it into our institution. And Hobbs was able of that, to suddenly delegate completely a crucial part of the exhibition. And he kept doing that over the years. And that's really someone that you can relate. I mean, Bruce Althusser called that the rise of the curator as a creator. And he's exactly that. You know, he suddenly found himself a position exactly in between the artist and the audience.
But speaking of anecdote, maybe you can explain these intriguing buttons, because we talk about Walter Hobbs. Because I've noticed some people wearing these things and they were not sure what it was. You want to tell us the story?
We decided there's a story, a very funny story about Walter Hobbs. Walter Hobbs, I think, or maybe was almost never got anywhere on time. And sometimes he was so late that he would disappear for a month. But when he went to work in Washington, the staff, and actually it was the security guards, created this button that said, Walter Hobbs will be here in 20 minutes. And everybody wore the button all the time. And when we first decided to recreate the button, we couldn't find any of them, although we eventually found one through the artist William Christian Barry, because he lives in Washington, and he has a drawer of Walter Hopp's memorabilia. And Walter Hobbs wrote an introduction for one of his books, which is how we found him. But it wasn't an art, the estate doesn't have the button because it wasn't an art project. It was really just made by the staff. And so we decided to recreate the button and give it to everybody. Zurich hopes that everyone will wear one.
What should we do?
What shall we do?
I don't know if you would have any questions on the book, not to Ulrich, obviously, but to some contents or to some issue about curatorial discussions. We saw you were a bit missing on Ulrich on this panel. No?
No.
Nobody? Jump. What makes a good show?
Krista.
Wow. It's a very good question.
What would Walter Hobbs say?
I don't know what he would say, but I guess I say a good show is, you need good art for a good show. And usually what's interesting with good shows is like often you realize there were good shows later on. And there is this kind of like sense of a show which can suddenly participate into the defining of a new art practice. So it's sometimes as hard to recognize a good exhibition as a good new emerging art practice. And I thought I kind of found always fascinating that a good show was, and something which was able to convey really how a new art was formed, often collectively. And I think what shows were able to do, at least in the 60s and 70s and much later up to the 80s and early 90s, is to give this idea of a generation at work. Like suddenly the relationship between the works are a very natural relationship because often all the pieces were made at the same time by the same generation of artists. So there's this kind of organic sense in the exhibition, this kind of fluidity from piece to piece that you could feel maybe in an exhibition from like When Attitude Become Form, you know, where basically the work was like a workshop which was installed during a very brief moment of time. But I guess, you know, you have many, many different definitions of what a good exhibition could be.
It's like Twombly, you know, back in the 50s and the 60s, you know, he didn't have very good shows. I suppose it's a point in time maybe later on in generations they accepted later.
They what?
Well, later on, like
delay.
some artists don't do very well, like in the certain period, and later on they do. Like that show that was shown then wasn't really accepted, but maybe 10 or 15 years time it is.
Yeah.
It's the way it's remembered.
Yeah.
And it
The
answers
funny
the
thing,
call.
like the most important show, nobody saw them.
Yeah.
But
That's what Zurich says.
we spend our life basically writing, talking about, trying to find photograph of a show which happened 40, sometimes even 10 years ago. but usually very, very few people saw the show. Even the artists in the show didn't see them. You know, I mean, I was like talking with Alan Ruppersberg recently, and he was included in When Attitude Become Form, and he was like 23 or 24, and he couldn't come to Europe. And he still regrets, you know, that almost his defining exhibition, he never saw it. And so, I mean, and you could go, you know, further, you know, an exhibition like No Man's Time at the Villa
We
Arson,
always made fun of
which
this.
is an exhibition that everybody has quoted in the last 20 years. Very, very few people actually were there. So it's one of those strange things that exhibition happen, and their legacy basically happened through rumors, basically bad photograph, description, oral communication, and to really make their way into a new generation of artists.
And there's still a lack of say, a good source book for this historical exhibition. I mean, there have been numerous anthologies on history of exhibition, but they were not going to the first-hand material. Most of them, they were depending on the second-hand.
Yeah.
And so they were taking for granted what has been published a bit later after the
and
show.
I think what changed everything too is the evolution of the catalog. You know, from the 1910s to today. I mean, the early exhibition catalogs are very humble objects. They're basically a list of objects, and they're very useful. At least you know what was shown. You don't know how it was shown, but you know what was shown. And later on, as catalog became more and more important in terms of basically bringing money to the museum and giving a larger audience to an institution or to a generation of artists, the catalogs needed to be ready for the time of the opening, but needed to be much larger than early in the 20th century. So the catalog became absolutely something else. You know, often the catalogs will give you no clue of what the exhibition was.
Really was.
And that's, I think, a real problem that we have to face all the time, is never to trust the catalog if you really want to understand what the exhibition actually was.
But couldn't you also argue that the idea of defining a movement by a generation is a bit archaic today? Especially when you see gaps. For example, the show currently at the Metropolitan Museum of Art called The Picture Generation, there's some real missteps in terms of who's included and who's not.
Yeah, I mean, I think at least it's an attempt. I mean, the Picture Generation show, for me, is an important exhibition because it's never perfect, but it had never been done. And at least they try to make people realize that the story was a collective story. And of course they forgot a few people, and the story needs to be fixed. And that's why basically we study and people, you know, do research. But I think it was an attempt to try to show that it was, those issues were shared by a generation of artists. And I think that's part of what, you know, should be done today. We could. Which part 1, part 2, and part 3. No, absolutely. I think every exhibition is just an attempt, and always, in a way, fail when its aim is historical, basically to reconstitute something which happened in very different locations. I mean, it's very strange to see that show, but I think it's great to see it at the Met. I mean, this material was not really made to be shown at the Met. It was in small downtown galleries and East Village galleries, and not in such a highly institutionalized context. And but at least there is an attempt which is very scholarly to try to redefine that period.
And it's a necessary one, because normally when you read the list of the artists who were in the picture show by Kremp, they are not really the ones that are listed in the magazines. There's a lot of artists who were actually not in this show. I mean, if you have the little catalog, at least if the catalog can be trusted to the point of the list of the artists, there's some artists who were never there, and later on were claimed to be part of this historical exhibition. So in a way,
we have another artist from the Picture Store generation with us, and it's a great honor. This is John Miller.
Maybe John wants to say a few words.
Maybe John would like to say a few words.
Actually, a little bit younger. I think it was like a generation after.
I know. I know,
but do you want me to say something about the show at the Met, which I just saw during the opening? But for me, despite some of the I've heard a lot of negative criticisms about the show. For example, that it didn't adequately represent the role of women and the kind of emergence of 80s generation feminism, which I think is actually a valid criticism. But for me personally, seeing the show, it's a good thing, because I thought I already knew everything that the artists included had done, and there was a lot there that I'd never seen before. And I suppose also, given the way that that show did turn out, it was interesting how central a role Jack Goldstein
Exactly.
has in all of that. But just going through the fair today, I saw William Levitt works at Margot Levin's booth, and he was a very important omission from that show. And so I don't know. That's a few comments off the cuff.
Generationally, is it still valid? Does it make sense?
I think we could argue, for example, that it's not so much generational, but it's all a specific methodology that is shared by the artists, like the artists around who did the show, like Philip Moreno and Pierre, all these artists collaborated. A lot of them went to school together. The group is formed and reformed, and maybe you could argue that the apotheosis of that was the Enli project, where they all, they all collaborated with this avatar. Whether they're not all exactly the same generation, which is sort of why I pointed to John. But the interests, but it's a question of issues and interest.
Christian.
I have a question going back to the initial point of, I guess, a history of curating, and the fact what Lionel pointed out, that there's no kind of proper anthology, or that we seem to missing a certain kind of literature. And listening to the conversation now, I have the feeling we're either talking sort of anecdotally about individual curators and what they did, and the proper medium for that seems to be the conversation, or the initial account, the original personal account, or we're talking about the artists. Basically, we're talking about whether or not a historical account of that generation, like Picture's generation, is a proper account of the artists that were included. But do you think that there is, or that there should be, a third kind of narrative, a third kind of account, maybe that looks at an exhibition as an object, or an exhibition as a form, or kind of what kind of language or what kind of way of describing you think we might need, or we have to imagine, in order to talk about curating as a practice that is not purely responsive to, identifying artists, or sort of personal as a reauthorization of the narrative, but might become something that can describe the object in a different way?
Well, it's something we had discussed with Christophe quite extensively when we were students. We had sometimes a bit the feeling we were looking at an history book where half of the pictures would be cut, that we would not have the full picture of. So that you would try to study what when attitude become form was, and you would find some exhibition reportage that Harald Zeeman had himself organized and published, and nothing else. And that was maybe 3 rooms out of the 7 rooms. And there was all what was outside the museum that was also not represented, and so on and so on. And in this case, the catalog is a typical special object that doesn't give you the proper information of what was exhibited. So we very often thought of the lack of little simple books that would be first-hand manuals documenting what the exhibition was actually. And when you curate yourself an exhibition, you know that you produce a lot of documents that are basically the tools for this reconstruction. It's a checklist, it's an insurance list, it's a transport list, it's a floor plan, it's captions, etc., etc. plus there are the first reception, some press release, some press reviews, some discussions, etc. So we thought recording that would be the first step. After that could come these books that would be, from an art historical point of view, informed and could analyze, you know, and make chains of exhibitions saying, oh, this, in this chain of conceptual exhibitions, for instance, this is particularly interesting or particularly important. But we were kind of blind until we had these little books that still don't exist. There is a project, actually an editorial project that, after all, is trying to launch for a couple of years.
Christophe is writing the first book.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that is supposed to be coming out at any time now.
We are waiting for it.
And that we are waiting for, absolutely. No, we are. And I think that's probably the main problems I had with a lot of the anthologies that came out on exhibition. Of course, the writer couldn't see the 10 by 10 exhibition of, when was that?
What?
Well, you cannot be there if you write from today in the 1910s or the 1920s. But some of the documents are accessible. Some documents you can find if you do the research. And most of the time it was never done. So it was an account from the 1940s of someone who had seen the show and had a vague memory, etc. And yeah, I mean, to me it became clear to continue with anecdote when I had once someone who drew me the floor plan of when Attitude Become Form and was placing on a tablecloth and was placing the objects, saying, oh, this was that. Suddenly I had a better understanding of the show than I ever had through what was published. So I think these books are very important and we are waiting them. I like the way it becomes a kind of almost a normal conversation, even if we have these things on the
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming and staying despite the absence of the master.